Now, he traded in his job as a lawyer to become a celebrated fiction author in Nigeria and beyond. Since then, Elnathan John has taken on a broad range of literary projects, including novels, satirical essays, and even a children's book. He's been described as a remarkably multi-genre author, and some of his original works have been shortlisted for the prestigious Kane Prize for African Writing. A particular favorite for Nigerians and foreigners alike is his book titled Becoming Nigerian, which focuses on Nigerian society and how to become a real Nigerian with brilliant satirical wit. Well, for all this, I'm suitably delighted to say that I'm joined now on the line from Berlin by the multiple award-winning author and lawyer, Elnathan John. Great to see you, Elnathan. Thank you very much indeed. I know we've been trying to get a hold of you for a while. You're a busy man and difficult to catch. But as I mentioned, you are something of a multi-genre author, as one German newspaper described you, because, I mean, you've written essays, satire, literary fiction, a graphic novel, and even a children's book. And you once described yourself as intellectually restless. Is that how you're able to pack so much variety into your body of work?
Thank you for that question. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm curious about the world. I'm curious about ideas. And so this makes me interrogate my work arsenal to find the most appropriate genre, the most appropriate medium to convey whatever message I'm doing. And I find that many times it's maybe not a novel, maybe it's a children's book, maybe it's a graphic novel. And so I'm very happy to move between genres, to move between modes of talking about literature, fiction, satire, as is required by the subject.
We're very glad that you range with ease through all those different genres. In fact, my producer Rita was saying that that's one of the things that makes you really interesting. And I think many people are particularly drawn to your essay collections and books. Prominent amongst them, of course, the much celebrated Becoming Nigerian, which is a satire of not just Nigerian life and how Nigerians live it, but also how ignorant foreigners perceive it. I mean, why did you choose to, as it were, make fun of the Nigerian experience?
Well, Nigeria is very dear to me. You can leave Nigeria, but Nigeria will never leave you. And so much of my work is dedicated to understanding the Nigerian condition, what it is that makes us exist within the systems that we exist in, our many dysfunctions, but also all of the things that we find interesting about the country. And so for me, satire was one way of interrogating all of the levels of power where we find abuse. And satire, of course, is not just about poking fun. It's also about holding up a light to power and saying, this is what you look like. It's saying, look at how silly all of this is. Look at how incredibly delusional this is. And so in a place where we have, every household has a pundit and we like to talk a lot in Nigeria, I found satire to be an effective way of moving away from very serious modes of conversation and interrogation of social politics. Satire is really useful because it forces people to introspect. It forces people to sometimes look at their own complicity in abuses of power.
I think I'm inclined to agree with you, and a lot of people will agree as well. And of course they did, because I mean, your how-to column in the newspaper became hugely popular, including how to be a Nigerian politician and how to worship a Nigerian god. But in the end, I mean, you decided to stop writing it. I guess for you it had run its course, but not for your fans, though.
Indeed, it had. the problem with columns like that is it's difficult to sustain for such a long period of time. However, I thought that once the book was done, that sort of series had ended, and then I began a new one, which were letters to Buhari, for example, the late president of Nigeria, and I had different series, and like we talked about in the beginning, I I sort of moved from interest to interest, and after that I started researching a very serious book, and so I had to put that on hold.
So, I mean, that how to column, I mean, I don't mean to sort of bang on about it, but the one thing that has stuck with many people is your use of the word hustle, which is how you ended your columns. And that word hustle has a particular meaning in the Nigerian context, doesn't it?
It does. It does. I mean, you often hear that if you push a Nigerian to the wall, they'll dig a hole in the wall and try to make it through. And so I think that with the many decades of dysfunction that we've had in Nigeria, unfortunately, Nigerians have realized that it might be futile to fight the system, and many people become complicit with the system because it's easier to go along with the flow so you get something in the end. And so it's okay, can I make a fast buck? Can I game the system since everyone else is gaming the system? Because they realize, just like look at the typical, for example, road situation where a motorist is, you know, faithfully following the queue and finds someone, taking the sidewalk and realizes that person moves very fast and decides, I'm not going to be the fool that follows the rules. And so that causes sort of people to sort of replicate this kind of dysfunction because they realize, well, it's the hustle, and we celebrate it, we worship it, we lionize people who are successful in this regard, and so it sort of self-perpetuates.
And I think that's what makes the satire that you're talking about very interesting, because just listening to the way that you're describing it, I mean, it really got through to me, and this is something that you sort of experience every day driving in Nigeria. And of course, since your newspaper columns ended, I mean, you've written books, but I'm wondering whether there's more sort of, you're seeing more sort of satire material floating about. I mean, are public figures in Nigeria doing more of the kind of things that would feed your satirical writing today?
Oh, certainly, certainly. However, the problem is with satire in Nigeria is, I always say, the effectiveness of satire is directly proportional to the ability of a population to feel shame. And so the weaker, shame is, the weaker satire is, because you can mock, leaders all you want. If they're immune or don't feel it, if they even sometimes laugh along, then what's the point? So, but then I think that there are many very brilliant satirists in Nigeria who are also doing this kind of work. Whether it's satirists who are doing it in terms of cartoons, or those who do it, say, for example, in the Hausa language, and we've seen people like Dan Bello who sort of poke fun at government and political figures. We've seen people like Asokwo EB, for example, who does the brilliant cartoons for Business Day. And so I'm also interested in people who do the kind of work that I do, because I like to support fellow enthusiasts of this very interesting genre, I think.
And I mean, is that where you're from, Kaduna? Because you were born
I
there.
am. Yes,
And I
I'm from
mean,
Kaduna.
how much has writing about contemporary Nigeria, with all its failures of leadership, elections, the economy, etc., become a political act for you? I mean, I'm wondering whether you intend your books and your essays to have a political impact.
That's an interesting and, I would say, slightly complicated question. And the reason why I say this is because often books that start out and position themselves as political often end up losing the audience because remember that people are struggling with their daily lives and all of the things that happen to us. And often literature is an escape for reality for some people. However, even when one's writing about personal matters, there is nothing for me that's not political. Like we say, even the personal is political. And so for me, I'm interested in general in the human condition, but in particularly the incarnation of this human condition within places like Nigeria, connected not just to contemporary events, but also to historical events and how, for example, our lack of interest in history, Nigerian history, forces us or makes us repeat the same events over and over again without learning from the past. And so, of course, all of my writing, I would say, is deeply political. Sometimes overtly, sometimes subtly, but certainly always dealing with politics. I particularly like seeing how we can ask ourselves the question: how are we individually implicated in these larger systems of dysfunction that we decry, all of us, especially Nigerians? We talk about our dysfunction all the time, but how are we all implicated in this larger system? And how does learning about the history of this dysfunction help us step away from these systems, or prevent us from replicating these things again and again and again?
Fascinating. I mean, you really are, in addition to being a writer, a philosopher as well. And I mean, I'm looking through a lot of your original works, some of them shortlisted for the prestigious Kane Prize for Africa Writing. I mean, what's next for you? What are you working on at the moment?
So I have three projects. One of them is a novel, which is a historical novel set in what is modern day Ningi in Bauchi State. And the novel covers the period 1800 to 1900. And it looks at, on the one hand, the Bori cosmology. Bori is a Hausa religion of spirit possession, which has very few practitioners today, but which really was one of the most popular religions in what we now call northern Nigeria. That, alongside the history of slavery in the Sokoto Caliphate, but most importantly for me, modes of transfer of knowledge between women, which is very often seldomly spoken about in the history. So we have, for example, a man called Hamza, who was a rebel in who eventually moved from Kano to Ningi in the 1840s to set up a sort of rebel town in opposition to the Kano and Bauchi emirates, and was sort of attacking and raiding for slaves. But we have very little about his wife. We have very little about the slave women that were around his compound. We have very little about all of the other women. And I sought to use my research in the history of slaves, the history of particularly women slaves in northern Nigeria, the history of indigenous religion and its connection to Islam, to recreate a story of how knowledge passed from woman to woman. We know how power, for example, passed from man to man. We know about Uthman Namfodio. We know about his son, his sons, his brother, all of the people who took over after that. But we know very little about the women, except, for example, famous women like Nana Asma'u, who was the daughter of Uthman Namfodio. And so it's important for me to look at the blind spots in our history and ask, how can fiction help us recreate this map of who we are? Because we know very little about this, unfortunately. That's one thing. And I'm also doing a novel set in Abuja. I've not done much work set in Abuja about mortality and a person who is sort of leaving religion,
Right.
In addition to sort of other interests that I have.
Well, it sounds fascinating, and I would look forward to particularly the first book that you were talking about. It just sounds really interesting. I want to thank you very much indeed, and congratulations once again on not only doing great work, but also doing Nigeria proud. Elnathan John is a multiple award-winning author and lawyer, and he was talking to me on the line there from Berlin.